Today is the 7th of April, 2015, and our title is A Decline of Jimmy Carter's Peace Strategy. In his last 2 years, 1979 to 1980. My guest is David DeWitt, reporter for the Athens News. I'm Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University, and this is Athens Speakout number 326. Now, the last time we had a discussion of Jimmy Carter's first 2 years, from 1976 to 78, in which Carter was the best president since World War II. He was the only one to finish a 4-year term without participating in a full-scale war. Now, in his last 2 years, unfortunately, in 1979 and 1980, he was provoked by the CIA, television, and the newspapers, and the hawks in the Senate and elsewhere to start participating in an undeclared war in Iran and Afghanistan. Carter was only the second president since Abraham Lincoln to put his religious values ahead of his political pursuits. He had religious values, moral values, and ethical values. And Abraham Lincoln was called Honest Abe from Illinois. He was an ordinary country lawyer. He only had one term in Congress in the 1840s before he ran for president. And in 1860, there was a tremendous split between the Whig Party, and there was a split within the Democratic Party over the slavery issue. So there were 4 parties running for president, and that's how the new party, the Republican, Abraham Lincoln, slipped in between the cracks. Now, the 4th minor party was called the Libertarian Party, or the Liberty Party, and they had most of their strength in the border states, Kentucky and Virginia. And they wanted to keep slavery as a state issue, but were not ready to join South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi in secession. So anyway, the Republican Party was based on the principle of no extension of slavery into the Kansas-Nebraska territory. But Abraham Lincoln did not yet come out for abolition of slavery when he won in a close race. The Whigs were rather a Whig party from the very beginning. Between 1840 and 1860, they were a second-class party because the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian Democrats won most of the elections. The Whigs only had 4 undistinguished presidents from 1840. They had the 9th president, the 10th president. The 11th president was Polk, and he made a big distinction as a Democrat. And the 12th president, the 13th, and 14th were Whigs, but their names were soon forgotten. Now, 1856, James Buchanan was elected, a weak Democrat from Pennsylvania, who came from the southern part of Pennsylvania, quite close to Hagerstown, Maryland, and his best friends in the Senate were all Southerners, so he wouldn't take a stand on the slavery issue. So you might call him a slave Democrat in the 1860 election. Now, President Carter won in 1976, 1980, because he worked hard to maintain peace between the Soviet Union and China and the Arab neighbors of Israel, and he then was very critical of Israel's foreign policy. Israel had won 2 wars in 1948 and 1967, And they got involved in two other wars in 1956 and 73 in which they were stalemate. So on the domestic side, Carter supported the New Deal, the Democratic Party, the ideas of Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And even Eisenhower was a liberal Republican who supported Keynesian economics. So Carter didn't have much trouble with Eisenhower as president. And Carter, as a religious man, appealed to some Roman Catholics and some liberal Jews, but his base was basically the Protestant South. And 20% of the Jews defected in 1980 and voted for the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan because Carter was considered weak on Israel. As Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance helped Carter draw up the legal treaties at the Camp David Accord of 1978, and Vance also went to Panama on peace missions to try and give the Canal Zone back to Panamanian nationalists. This was not very popular among the voters and was another reason why Carter was only a one-term president. They would prefer war over peace because war is popular and peace is a hard sell. Israel then and the UN ambassadors got involved in the April 1979 Iranian problem. And in April of 1979, there was talk among the PLO at the UN that Jimmy Carter was in trouble. So I think we'll have our first question to my guest, Dave DeWitt. How did the major multinational corporations, mostly Anglo-American companies, cooperating with OPEC, sabotage Jimmy Carter's domestic economic programs?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned, I think, very astutely earlier that Jimmy Carter's administration, for its first 2 years, it was recovering from the 73 to 75 recession, but it was building, it was growing. The job growth and the economy was growing, at least at historical average levels, and if not exceeding that. By the 1979 energy crisis, that's when things started to go downhill.
Right.
And I think one of the main areas of collusion that you refer to in that question, perhaps between major corporations, is when that happened, when the energy crisis hit, Carter sought, like Nixon did, to ask Congress to impose price controls on energy, medicine, and consumer prices. Congress opposed him bitterly.
That's right.
And he was unable to get any of that accomplished. And I think that exacerbated the problem and undermined his economic.
one of his problems.
Yeah.
But it was a little deeper than that. I think we have to go down backwards to Keynesian economics. Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy had all used planning and taxes for the benefit of full employment. Mm-hmm. Now, the Vietnam War undermined Keynesian economics. And Johnson and Nixon went into debt not to fight unemployment, but to finance long, unwinnable wars. That was debt for a different reason.
Robert, perhaps I'm asking this question too early. You're probably going to answer.
No, you can. Oh, it's never too early.
When did they abandon John Maynard Keynes' economic plan and go with Milton Friedman?
Well, Milton Friedman was an economist who believed in Adam Smith's laissez-faire.
Right.
Now, when you say they, you mean the Republican Party.
Exactly.
The Republican Party.
Did they wait till Reagan got in, or?
Well, no, they were talking about it as soon as, Reagan popularized it.
Right.
It was
But,
building for a long
it-
time at the University of Chicago.
The University of Chicago School was pushing Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
And Milton Friedman was saying, there's a global market, and the global market is free. Now, Keynesian economics is based on the nation state. Keynes told Roosevelt, if full employment is your first goal, you're going to have to manipulate the interest rates. You're going to have to tax in order to get full employment. Now, the laissez-faire people don't like that. They like low taxes
Right.
and supply and demand. So Milton Friedman, in my opinion, is a reactionary.
Oh, I agree with that.
Now, do you have some
I'd have some
brief for
harsher
Milton Friedman's
words for Milton
economics?
Friedman than that.
Well, my question was, did Carter?
No, Carter-
Carter did not incorporate it
Nope.
into his plan.
He was still for Keynes.
And when Ronald Reagan took over,
Right.
they
Right.
implemented that.
That's right. Ronald Reagan was for Milton Friedman. He was for low taxes. That's the first thing Ronald Reagan talked about, low taxes. Now, Roosevelt was hated by the banks because Roosevelt raised the income tax in order to subsidize Social Security, CCC, WPA. He subsidized the unemployed, the old, the young, and the unions. He gave the unions bargaining rights, and wages went up. Now, under Ronald Reagan, they wanted to smash the unions, and so did Milton Friedman.
But one of the things I remember was towards the end of the Carter administration was the double-digit inflation and everything, and I think that's what Ronald Reagan ran on. That was, let's
That's
reduce
right.
that.
That's right.
And,
That double digit is what I'm talking about now. OPEC is the one who motivates and is the motor for the inflation,
Right.
because OPEC says if we nationalize the oil fields, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran have enough oil to raise the price.
Right.
And the Anglo-American cartel, which kept a stable price of $1 in 1970, could no longer do that.
Right.
And Gaddafi said, oh, we'll raise it to $2. And then we'll raise it to $3. And then each year they raise it $5, $10. And by the time that that Carter left office in 1980, it was up to $40 a barrel.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't bother the banks,
No.
because the banks just went into debt. The banks had inflation, and they just raised the prices of automobiles,
Right.
textiles, everything that the Arabs had to import, and they had to import expensive arms, F-4s, so forth and so on. Well, Lockheed and Boeing just raised the price of the airplane.
Level the playing field.
Well, it equalized itself.
Yeah.
Now, the consumers in America didn't have that power.
No, they suffered. They suffered.
So when I ran on the McGovern ticket in 1972, I was telling the voters how bad Nixon was, because gold was only $35 an ounce when Roosevelt was president. It was only $35 when Carter was president, but now it was up to $72 a barrel. Wow. I had no idea it would go up to $1,260. That's where it is now, an ounce. So Nixon had to eliminate the gold exchange standard,
Right.
which was invented by John Maynard Keynes. And Milton Friedman clapped his hands. Well, that's back to free pricing. Well, that's fine.
David was talking about collusion earlier.
Collusion,
Perhaps that was collusion.
Yeah, that's collusion. Okay, so I guess we're up to the problem Carter had in fighting inflation. All he could do was pass the price on. But he was not responsible for the ultimate cause of inflation. And of course, the oil companies didn't explain that.
No, yeah. Well, OPEC doubled the price of crude oil.
Right.
And
It's soon
that
gonna-
sent inflation into double-digit levels,
Right, you got it.
skyrocketing into there.
So Keynes was fading fast in the Carter administration.
And I also just want to point out that we're still very much dealing with the reverberations of
Oh,
the
yes.
Milton Friedman philosophy.
The debt has not been solved. What is it, $18 trillion.
Yeah, well, the debt, not only has the debt not been solved, but we've seen over the past 40 years.
A Chinese debt, a debt with China.
That too, but we've seen wages more or less stagnate.
You got it.
And we've seen the debt rise, and
Right.
we've seen taxes go down, and we've seen corporate profits skyrocket.
Right.
But it's not being shared. And
Well,
go on.
going back to Nixon in 1971, he closed the gold window. And that means he devaluated the gold exchange standard and said, okay, we're going with Milton Friedman, and we're going to put gold on the free market. Well, that means that the paper dollar inflates as fast as the Japanese yen, the German Deutschmark, the French franc, and those stronger capitalist countries turned in their paper dollars and said, I want gold reserves. De Gaulle was the first one to do it. And then the Germans followed that. So the value of the Deutschmark began to creep up because there was more gold backing and they had fewer dollars, paper dollars, that were inflating. That's the problem of the gold exchange extent. It was a temporary fix
Right.
in 1944 with the Bretton Woods, and it led to a great boom from 1945 to 1965. But,
Robert,
yeah.
what year was Charles de Gaulle? When did he?
Well, he came into power in 1958. And in 1969, he stayed from 58 to 69. But because of the Vietnam, de Gaulle was the first one who told Johnson and Nixon both, you're not going to be able to win that war. If the French couldn't defeat Ho Chi Minh, you're not going to be able to defeat Ho Chi Minh. They have too many illiterate peasants, and the atomic bomb is not going to work. So sooner or later, you're going to have to throw in the chip. Well, confident Lyndon Johnson said, no, no, no. We have tanks, we have airplanes, we can beat those little Viet Cong. General Westmoreland, oh, we can beat them. Okay, came Tet Offensive, 1968, the last term. Well, suddenly, Johnson is faced with the fact that McNamara says you can't win.
Right.
So he says, okay, I'm not going to be the president. We'll let Hubert Humphrey try it. Well, Nixon won 4 more years, and he keeps inflating the dollar. Now, Kissinger goes along with that, but Kissinger, in the back of his mind, knows that this is a disguised retreat. And he's telling Nixon, fine, but we're going to take 20,000 out this month, 30,000 next month. So they got the 580,000 troops down to 20,000 by election day in 1972, and Nixon won the election. And he won the election because he got all of the Hawk vote, and he got half the Dove vote, because half the Democrats could see through, well, we really don't need McGovern. We can vote for Nixon, and he'll flop when he gets in there. And Kissinger's going to pull the rug up from without him, and that's exactly what happened. In 1973, he goes to Paris and signs a secret deal with Louis Ducteau, and gradually the Republicans wake up, hey, Saigon is going to collapse. And that's what happened. And poor Jerry Ford took the rap.
Yeah.
In 1975, Kissinger was giving the advice, well, you got to take the helicopters out and the last of the supporters will fly back to the United States. Well, that's what happened. Well, now, unfortunately, Carter knew that. And when Carter came in 1976, he was saying amnesty. Forget the Vietnam War. Bury it. Let's have détente. Let's negotiate with Soviet Union and China. But he didn't know that the Iranian crisis and the Afghan crisis were two facts beyond his control. And that's what happened in 79 and 80. Well, let me see if I got anything more to say about OPEC. Well, we can clarify that by OPEC meets once a year at Vienna, and there are 14 oil-producing countries that are in it. But the big three, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, set the prices. And Venezuela and Indonesia, Algeria, they just go along with the big three. If they want to inflate it, they'll inflate it. So that's what was happening under Jimmy Carter's administration. And the banks could pass the inflation on. And the Saudis in the 80s began to backtrack. And the American banks in the 80s began to recover, and the energy crisis peaks in 1980 because Saudi Arabia discovers we're now a gold power. We have so much money, we can get into the International Monetary Fund. So Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq have a little conflict. Saudi Arabia is satisfied at $40 a barrel. Iran and Iraq said, we've got to have more money to buy more weapons to defeat each other. And that led to an undeclared war, or not an unknown war.
Yeah.
The Iraqi-Iranian war lasted from 80 to 88.
In which we supplied the Iraqis with
That's right.
ammunition. The Iraqis led by Saddam Hussein.
You got it.
We supplied them with
You
weapons.
got it. You got it. That's exactly what happened. And the CIA, first they're on one side, then on the other.
Yeah.
They support Iraq against Iran, and then they turn around and say, well, now we better back Iran against Iraq. Now we got to back, we're going to withdraw? No, we're not going to withdraw. I don't think Obama knows how he can get through the next 2 years. Is it going to be
with regard to right now with ISIS? And
yeah, is it going to be a 2-year war, or is it going to be a 30-year war? Does he have control? No.
I think he wants to avoid
He's treading water.
sending-
He's
he
treading
is.
water. Yep, that's the problem. Well, anyway, gold was $16 an ounce back in 1914, $35 an ounce fixed by Roosevelt, and that stayed the part of the dollar reserves up until 1971. And it was turncoat Governor Conley who told Nixon, well, we can keep inflation down and the consumer will not know that their gasoline prices are going up. They don't feel it.
Right.
And that's how Conley became a Republican and helped Nixon.
Conley of Texas, right?
Yeah, he helped Nixon get elected, and he was the guy who had price controls for Conley. I mean, Conley had price controls for Nixon. So Nixon then had a bipartisan control. But Nixon was wise in a way. He says, we have a cage. We're going to have full price controls for 6 months. Then we're going to make the cage a little smaller, and we'll gradually reduce them over a year.
Yeah.
Because they figured out within a year the price of oil will have gone up enough to pay for the tax bill.
Yeah.
So then Conley retired and Nixon retired with no price controls. So it was a temporary fix.
Yeah.
And that was pretty smart.
And you had the Federal Reserve at the time easing.
Yeah, they inflated the money in
Easing
order to
their
get
policy,
Nixon,
right.
in order to get Nixon elected in '72.
Right.
And then Ford and Carter had to pay the bill with inflation. And they didn't know why it was inflated. Well, Carter knew, and Kissinger knew. But he said, Ford, the only thing you can do is gradually reduce the tax burden on the people.
Right. And so they start
Right.
introducing the supply side thinking.
Yeah, so Kissinger knew that Ford would probably be a one-term president. He could not be reelected.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And then he gave Carter the advice, well, all you can do is follow the Federal Reserve. Now, Volcker was the appointee of Carter.
Mm-hmm.
And he did raise interest rates. And that causes unemployment. That's Keynesian policy.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1980, everybody had a claim that Carter and the Federal Reserve was causing unemployment.
That's what they claim.
Well, it's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Volcker was an honest Federal Reserve director. He said, well, the only way to stop the
Now-
debt is to raise the interest rates.
And then Reagan replaced him with Greenspan.
That's right.
And
they go back to,
Greenspan is an
'cause-
Ayn Rand inspired.
Right. Debt forever. Debt
yeah.
doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Well, that's a fraud. Well, you're kind of getting a little bit ahead of the story.
Sorry, yeah.
Anyway, we more or less got OPEC clarified, I guess. Do you have any further comments on how it works?
No, I think we covered that.
Well, I want to get up to, well, I might say something about this Greenspan crash. Because this debt, see, Greenspan retires in
Volcker.
Volcker retires in 1987, and Greenspan gets the job in 1987, right? And that leads to the great bubbles of 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, when you have a real estate bubble, an insurance bubble, and one debt followed another. And under Greenspan and Milton Friedman, they said, well, there'll never be another depression of 1929. Well, the depression comes because debt does matter. Well, okay, I guess we're ready for another question. I think I'd rather go to a statement, if I may. I want to do a little review of the transition of United States war games against Soviet Union and how they transferred that to war games against Middle East nations. That was a slow, gradual change.
Yeah.
Because as Vietnam faded and as the Soviet Union collapsed and was getting weaker, and the Middle East problem was getting worse and worse. So in 1967, we had the Third Arab-Israeli War, big victory. And in 1973, Kissinger uses the balance of power strategy and gets a stalemate between Egypt and Israel. And the Suez War was another stalemate. So Eisenhower and Carter and George Bush 41 were the only 3 presidents among the 12 who ever said no to Israel. Mm-hmm. And that's why Carter lost a lot of the Jewish vote in 1980.
Right.
Because Reagan backed Israel 100%, and Jimmy Carter seemed to be backing off his complete support with his amnesty peace program. So Carter then lost the economic race, and the Pentagon began to seek action in the Middle East. And British diplomacy was ahead of American diplomacy in understanding the difference between the Near East and the Middle East. And I'd like to say something about the organization of the State Department at the end of World War II. The end of World War II, the United States had a Far East index, and the Americans regarded the Far East as the #1 problem. And the State Department assumed that the Middle East and the Near East would be handled by the British Empire in 1945. And the British then regarded the Middle East and the Near East as their #1 problem. So there was a kind of a special relationship between the United States and Britain. And in 1954, the British and French were warning the Americans that they should get out of Indochina and recognize Hanoi. And the Americans didn't take that advice. They were still dedicated to the anti-communist Cold War ideology. And then in 1956, the British and French were getting out of Africa. Once they left Suez, they said, well, the rest of those colonies aren't worth much. So the British Empire and Commonwealth just become the Commonwealth.
Robert, let's take a station break.
Yeah, well, we better take a station break. We're talking with Dave DeWitt, and we're talking about the problems of Jimmy Carter when he first came into office. He thought that the Soviet Union and China were the big issues, and that he, as a Christian, could resolve, he had great faith that he could resolve the Arab-Palestinian problem. And it turned out to be a backfire for Jimmy Carter's own re-election, and he didn't make it for complex reasons. Well, anyway, to continue a little bit on this transition, John Foster Dulles was officially a Presbyterian, but he was a bad Christian because he wanted to have a kind of a Manichaean anti-communist policy straight through to his death. And he was the one who got Eisenhower involved in Indochina and setting up the South Vietnamese puppet government. Well, getting back to the State Department, the State Department had a West European desk and an East European desk and a Far East desk and a Middle East desk and a Latin American desk. That was their order of priorities. And if you look at the West European desk, they had a subsection, a British desk, a French desk, an Italian desk, and then the East European desk included the Baltic republics and Poland. And the Far Eastern desk was strong because they thought the next war would be with Communist China and Korea and so forth, and Vietnam. And Vietnam grew out of the victory of China in the Second World War, provided by America's defeat of Japan. But the Chinese were still pushing for further revolution. So the British Foreign Office was a little bit different organization. They had the Foreign Office, the Home Office, the War Office, and the Colonial Office. And what's called the Home Office is called the Attorney General in the United States. And looking at the Foreign Office, they had a West European department, which handled Spain and Portugal, and a Central department, which handled France and Germany, and a Southern department, which handled Italy, and a Northern department, which handled Soviet Union and Scandinavia. And the Near East department included Palestine, Syria, and the British Mandate countries, and the French Mandate countries, and Turkey. And the Far East desk was rather small in Britain, and they relied on America's leadership in the Far Eastern problem. And that's how the balance of power was understood between the British Foreign Office and the State Department. But it was a limited balance of power, which was based on this special relationship, which Eisenhower and Macmillan understood, but which the ideologues in the Republican Party had no idea how foreign policy is designed. So, from 1957, when Eisenhower had a falling out with Anthony Eden over the Suez Crisis, they repaired that, and in 1957 to date, the special relationship was back in business, and they were cooperating on Iranian Middle East problems. But the British were stepping out of Iranian politics, and the Americans were stepping in. So that's what I wanted to do, is kind of show you the change subtly in the Middle East between British and American relations and oil diplomacy. So the CIA and the MI6 and the MI5 cooperated under the Eisenhower administration to overthrow the Mossadegh regime. Now that was an Iranian problem which BP had to face back in 1951 to 53. And Eisenhower then supported the British, and this was the greatest CIA accomplishment, was to overthrow Mossadegh, a prime minister who was kind of socialistically inclined and wanted to nationalize the oil fields.
Oh, imagine that, the CIA overthrowing somebody who's socialist.
Well, the CIA did it secretly, and they put the Shah back in power.
Yes.
Now, the CIA had a short-run victory because BP and Exxon then more or less controlled the Iranian production and the Saudi production, and both the British and the Americans and NATO were gaining by that stability. But you see, in 1979, with the Iranian Revolution,
Right.
they're undoing the Shah's installment,
Yeah.
and they're blaming the
It was a
Americans
backlash.
and the CIA.
It was a very interesting revolution too,
Right.
because it wasn't, the precursors to it weren't the typical things that precursor a revolution. They had relative stability, but it was a backlash against westernization, against
Right.
capitalism,
That's right.
against BP and Exxon.
right.
And it turned from a populist movement originally, I would characterize it, toward its religious,
Yeah, well,
Islamic
Mossadegh was gone,
fundamentalism.
and the student revolutionaries and the middle class, who was suffering from oil prices, were
Right, that's
going-
why it started as populist.
Yeah. well, they gravitated around this Ayatollah Khomeini,
Right,
who went into exile under the Shah, because the Shah was somewhat of a secularist.
yes.
He
But
was
he
cooperating,
represented the capitalist
but it
Western
represented
interests.
liberal capitalism.
Right,
Well, the Ayatollah Khomeini was an Iranian nationalist. So the students in the middle class said, well, okay, he can be our new leader once we overthrow this Shah.
yeah.
And that's how this revolution got started in 1979. This was totally unanticipated by,
Oh, nobody saw it coming.
yeah, nobody in the United States saw it
Right,
coming.
yeah.
And Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Vance didn't know why the Ayatollah suddenly became a figure. And he became an ideological figure supporting, and they called this the Islamic Republic.
Yeah. Right,
Never
yeah.
before did you have an Islamic Republic.
Right.
So this is a kind of a synthesizes between the radical left and the traditional Muslim Shiite brand of religion. Very interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think they came to see the Shah as representative as a puppet of the Western powers.
Well, he was.
Really, and
he
yeah,
was.
he was.
He was,
Yeah.
because you see, the deal that the CIA and BP and Exxon figured was that the Shah got 17% of the profits, and the rest went to the big oil companies.
Right, and where's that leave the people?
Yeah, well, the people begin to say, well, under Gaddafi's plan, our OPEC, and Iran joins OPEC. Well, once we have this Iranian national oil company, we'll be able to get 100% of the profits. We'll nationalize it and become the Iranian
Yeah,
company. We'll do the same thing that the Saudis do, and the Iraqis and the Iranians. But that wasn't as easy to accomplish as they thought, but that was their ambition, to either get at least 50% and maybe 100%. That was the faith of the middle class and the students in 1979. But the West still had bargaining power through the banks and the Saudis,
right.
and it didn't quite become a total victory for
And
the...
eventually turned to supporting Iraq.
Right, okay. So
And warfare.
let's go to a brand new question. Why did Carter's policy and his talks with Leonid Brezhnev on détente ultimately fail? What happened to that idea of détente and nuclear negotiations?
Well, it was the second round of the so-called SALT
That's right.
negotiations.
That's right.
And as I understand, there were two big things that happened that autumn. The first was that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan.
Yeah, that ended the discussions.
Right.
Because Carter then said, hey, wait, you're not.
Right.
See, Carter thought he could keep this nuclear thing in one box. And that what he said about China or Iran wouldn't have any effect.
Right.
But Brezhnev saw Carter as a little bit insincere. Because he says, let's have a nuclear disarmament, but at the same time, I'm going to
But
be...
he still wanted to keep some things.
He wanted
and-
public support for human rights in Africa.
Right.
And he was denouncing the Cuban intervention there. And he was
Yeah.
giving publicity to Red China, to Beijing.
And that's, you mentioned Cuba, the
So
second.
Brezhnev says, hey, what side are you on? Whose side are you on?
Yeah.
So they began to get suspicious.
And
So-
that's the other thing I wanted to mention about it was in Cuba, the revelation that what changed the public's opinion about it, the revelation that the Russians had a brigade stationed, a Soviet combat brigade stationed in Cuba.
Well, that happened under Kennedy back in 1963.
It went in under Kennedy, but
Right.
at the time they didn't know that.
Well,
It
Cuba...
wasn't widely known. Carter was still trying to tell people that this was recent. This wasn't.
Carter still was suspicious of communist Cuba,
Yeah.
but there was no battles on the forefront except in Africa.
Right. That would have been the
Cubans sent a
only
brigade.
where it actually hit the ground. Yeah.
So then Carter was denouncing Cuban intervention in Angola, where the United States had oil. And then Brezhnev would say, Angola, that's none of your business.
Yeah.
This is big oil. This is capitalism.
Right.
So Brezhnev says, I don't think you're really too sincere. I think we'll delay that
Yeah.
SALT II ever becoming another disarmament treaty. So
Right. And then
it
Reagan
stalled.
came in and scuttled the whole
Yeah,
thing.
Reagan came.
But didn't Richard Nixon, he established the relationship with the United States and the Soviet Union with Brezhnev, correct?
Yeah, Brezhnev.
And then when Jimmy Carter came in, it became a different type of relationship. I mean, as
Yeah.
far as, I think Brezhnev, believe it or not, Brezhnev actually liked Nixon better than he did Carter.
Yes,
And if you were
because
gonna trust two individuals, who would you trust, Richard Nixon or Jimmy Carter? I mean,
well, you
that's a
see,
joke.
Brezhnev,
Yeah.
like Kissinger, like Winston Churchill,
Right.
like Joseph Stalin, like Winston Churchill, they all knew the balance of power game.
Right,
It wasn't clear how much of the balance of power Jimmy Carter really understood,
yeah,
because he put religion and ideology first.
yeah.
And he thought that this Arab-Israeli problem could be settled by good faith negotiations. Well, the communists are a little bit more subtle. You know what Lenin said about liberals?
No.
They are useful idiots that can be used until we're ready for the revolution.
Some people still say that. Right?
Yeah, so you have the hammer and sickle. I'm for the working class. I'm for the farmers. I'm for the peasants.
Yeah.
That was the situation in 1917 when the revolution begins. Then in 1919, Lenin says, "Oh no, it's communism is not the triumph of the working class. It's the Communist Party." That becomes democratic centralism. We're for democracy, but because of the revolution and the foreign intervention, that democracy has to be postponed. Centralism now, democracy later.
Okay,
And that's what Stalin played.
right,
And he could switch the party line.
yeah.
And Red China today, or Communist China, or People's Republic of China, still believe in democratic centralism. Capitalism for the economy, but the party is still centralized. Censorship.
Yeah.
You can't have democracy in Tiananmen Square.
Right.
You can't have free elections. We're not ready for free elections. So that's the problem with definition of communism. Who defines the party? Hanoi? Havana? Tito in Belgrade? And that's what your one party thinkers in the Republican Party, all communists are the same. Put them in a basket.
Yeah.
That's simplistic thinking. And Jimmy Carter had great faith in negotiations in 1976 because he could see the balance of power between Egypt and Israel. And he could see the balance of power between China and Soviet Union. But he couldn't see that Brezhnev could change the party line.
Right.
He had a one-party line. Well, he had a two-party line, Christianity and democracy. And he thought that Christianity and democracy could be expanded in the Middle East. Very, very dubious. The Muslims are not yet ready. That's a tough sell. So Jimmy Carter turned out to be a one-term president, I guess is what we're saying. So I just want to focus again on the general, that generally speaking, Carter was sincere in having a peaceful negotiations between Red China and People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. And amnesty was a good line, but it couldn't be carried through for 2 terms. That's the reality of the Middle East. The balance of power people are based on realism. Yeah. You got to be prepared to move across that balance, that scale. You got to tip to the other side.
Well, it's a lot of power plays.
It's a lot of power play.
Being shrewd, manipulative.
One of the great definitions of balance of power was a British Prime Minister by the name of Lord Palmerston.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I've heard this before.
Well, we were talking so much about Kissinger's balance of power.
Yeah.
But Lord Palmerston says that England has no permanent friends. She has no permanent enemies. She only has permanent interests.
Yeah.
And the number one interest is the British-English Channel.
Yeah.
And we don't care whether it's Spain or Austria or Prussia or Russia. Whoever threatens that channel is temporarily the enemy of the moment. Mm-hmm. So Britain is ready to negotiate, but they're also ready to move across the other side of the scale when necessary. That's the balance of power.
Yeah.
And Winston Churchill said in 1935, he said the only way to defeat Hitler is to have an alliance of France, England, and the Soviet Union. I don't care if they're communist or not.
Yeah.
You got to have that Russian army.
Oh, yeah.
And he told Franklin Roosevelt that. Well, you got to have that Russian army unless you want to go in there with American boys.
Yeah.
Okay, Roosevelt goes along with it.
But especially
you got to have history.
Germany.
You got to have history with about.
You got to push them into.
Carter
somewhere.
did not have a deep enough history of it.
Well, and it's. I mean, I think that you also bring up the point that he was more ideological. I think that he probably believed more in the better aspects of human nature.
That's right.
And perhaps naively.
He was a little bit naive. Well, anyway, to look at the Soviet side, Brezhnev is not Hitler, and the Soviet Union under Brezhnev is not Germany. So all the Republicans could do is go back to appeasement, back to Munich. They must have used that Munich.
They're playing that same thing today with Iran. They're saying the Iran deal's appeasement now.
Yeah, that's right. Well, anyway, Brezhnev begins to say, well, let's delay on SALT II. He signed it, but we had no follow-up. We didn't have an atmosphere test ban treaty.
Yeah.
And we didn't get the ABM treaty.
And it was never, the Senate never...
Well, the Senate probably wouldn't have ratified if it had happened. But what happened was that SALT I had a follow-up under Nixon, and Carter had to repudiate it because of events in Iran and Afghanistan. Well, I guess we've said all we want to say about that. Now, the physics department under Oppenheimer knew that the nuclear bomb was not a weapon, it was a suicide device. So they were advocating détente and negotiations ever since 1945. And Kennedy made the first step, Nixon made the second step, and Jimmy Carter had faith that he would make the third step. But there was a physicist by the name of Edward Teller who did not agree with Oppenheimer and agreed that you could never, agreed with Zabriskie, you can't negotiate with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So what happened was that technologically a new bomb was invented, the neutron bomb. And it was really accidentally by the arms manufacturers for Jimmy Carter. And they said to Jimmy Carter, well, are you going to deploy the neutron bomb? Well, Jimmy Carter ran into another storm in Germany. What is the purpose of a neutron bomb? Do you know anything about it?
I mean, aside from its power, no, I don't know.
It was a bomb which was small. It was a tactical weapon.
Right.
And it would only emit radioactivity and kill all the people, but leave the building standing.
Right.
It's invented by a madman. Edward Teller.
Yeah.
So he says, Helmut Schmidt says to Jimmy Carter, well, you must be crazy. You can't deploy that. That so-called tactical weapon is the ultimate weapon if it's ever used in Germany.
Yeah.
Germany's too small.
Yeah.
So that had to be canceled. But once the publicity got out, Jimmy Carter was losing friends and allies. That was another boo-boo.
Sure.
He should have never discussed the neutron bomb. He should have kept that in the closet.
Yeah.
Well, you see, Jimmy Carter started out in Annapolis, and he was trained as a nuclear scientist on nuclear submarines. And he thought that since he knew the technology, he could get into the politics. And when he became president, he understood that politics is much more complicated than mere atomic energy.
Sure.
Yeah. So he was a little bit too optimistic on his own ability to negotiate about this technical weapon. So anyway, the information about that was another black mark on Jimmy Carter's talents. So in June of '79, that's the key date, Jimmy Carter met with Brezhnev and signed the agreement known as SALT II, but it never went any further because in June of '79, the CIA was beginning to say, there's something brewing here with this Iranian revolution. So Edward Teller then was forgotten, and he died a unheralded death in 2009. But Oppenheimer had his security clearance removed back in the 1954 bikini test, because when the bikini test was saying Oppenheimer said, well, don't make a hydrogen bomb. Well, then he was regarded as a security threat. So I guess we'll go to a third question now. How did Zbigniew Brzezinski's negotiations with Poland, did those help or hinder Carter's overall objectives in the Middle East?
Robert, I wanted to interrupt a second. Hey, you got about 2 minutes remaining in the program.
I guess we can't get into that. We'll have to stop here.
Oh.
It's a good point to stop.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So do you want to summarize about OPEC and Jimmy Carter's kind of slowdown in June of '79?
Well, I think,
and
yeah. Well,
kind
I
of
think
anticipate what this is going to lead to?
a confluence of interests. I think some of them more malignant than others.
Right.
Came together to kind of undermine what Jimmy Carter wanted to accomplish, both internationally and domestically. Domestically with the economy and internationally with diplomacy.
Right. And I agree with that, and I think that the defeat of Jimmy Carter was a great tragedy, and I voted for him anyway. But I was an insider in a sense, because I, like George McGovern, I regarded myself as an expert on Chinese relations and Soviet relations. And the average senator gets his information from television. And the Munich cliches and the lack of historical knowledge on their part is the reason why Jimmy Carter was regarded with the voters as an appeaser, a weak, and nobody grieved that Ronald Reagan won. And Ronald Reagan did win in 1980 with a big percentage of the Jewish vote. The Jewish vote was 90% for Roosevelt in 1944. It was 80% for Hubert Humphrey in 1968. In 1980, it dropped to 60%. And the Democratic Party needed every Jew. And since the Jews were beginning to think that Ronald Reagan has more sympathy for Israel, Jimmy Carter was kind of sunk.
Yeah.
And Ted Koppel was a Jewish reporter, dug pins into Ronald Reagan and helped defeat them.
And let's not forget the Israel lobby.
That's what I was talking about,
Right.
the Israeli lobby.
Yeah.
It's subtle. But Jimmy Carter's not a fan of Israel.
Yeah, wrap it up.
Yeah. So this is Athens Speakout, and our slogan is, debate is the oxygen of democracy, and I welcome you to this show, and I hope we can come again next week.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor.